Welcome to Nocturnal Tales. Tonight we step into the polished, perilous world of Edwardian London, where money and manners keep the worst intentions beautifully concealed. The adventure of the Indiscreet photograph follows Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson from Baker Street into the West End, when a celebrated Bond Street couturier is found dead in circumstances that look almost too convenient, and one small detail refuses to behave. This is a story about appearances, about what society chooses to call an accident, about how easily time can be bent by a single convincing voice, and about the quiet power of objects that remember what people would rather forget. As always, this is an original Nocturnal Tales story, written in the spirit and style of the great Golden Age mysteries, but entirely our own creation. And if you'd like more stories, you can find our full back catalogue on Patreon and Spotify, with extra new stories there as well. The links are in the description. Now then, listen closely, keep your conclusions in check, and do not trust the obvious too soon. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Man in the Bath. In looking back upon the many strange affairs in which I had the honour to assist Sherlock Holmes, I am bound to admit that some of the gravest have arisen not from the violent classes, nor from the obscure corners of London, but from those polished circles in which vice walks best gloved. There are crimes committed in drawing-rooms, which differ from those of the alley only in manner, and I have seen murder stand as calmly beside a silver luncheon service as ever it did beneath a gas lamp by the river. The singular case of Lucien Roland of Bond Street was of that description. It was in the spring of 1902 that Inspector Lestrade called one morning at Baker Street and found Holmes in one of those silent humours which usually marked the active working of his mind. My friend had thrown himself at length upon the sofa, his eyes closed, his long fingers joined, while I sat by the fire with the British Medical Journal upon my knees, and the comfortable illusion that the day might pass without disturbance. Such illusions seldom survived the arrival of Lestrade. He came in quickly, his trim figure damp from the street, his expression that of a man who had been wrestling since breakfast with a case which refused to grow orderly. Holmes half opened one eye. "You have come from the West End, Lestrade," said he. "You have already seen the body, spoken with at least 3 witnesses, and been offered coffee which you were too impatient to drink." Lestrade threw his gloves upon the table. "One would think, Mr. Holmes, that there was no use in a man speaking at all in this room." "On the contrary," said Holmes, sitting up, "speech is often necessary in order to confirm the obvious. Pray take a chair." I handed the inspector a cigarette, which he accepted absently. "It may prove simple enough," said he, "but I do not like the look of it. The dead man is Lucien Roland." "The couturier," said I. "The very man? Bond Street. Dresses half the fine ladies in London and charges the other half for wishing he would. A smart fellow, prosperous, fashionable, and by all accounts difficult to refuse." Holmes had now risen and was standing with his back to the mantelpiece. "Proceed." "He gave a private presentation yesterday afternoon of some new models. The thing was a great success. This morning he was expected at a small luncheon at the house of Lady Honoria Vane in Mayfair. He never arrived. Later his servant found him dead in his bath." "In his bath?" I repeated. "Yes, and with a telephone receiver in his hand." That brought Holmes fully awake. The receiver was in his hand. "So I am told. The telephone instrument itself stands in the dressing-room adjoining, and the receiver had been dragged out by the cord. The first notion was some sort of accident. Shock, perhaps. Water and electricity make a tidy explanation for servants." "And for policemen?" said Holmes. Lestrade made a face. "For careless policemen, perhaps. The local doctor has not committed himself. He says there are marks about the man which do not please him, and he will say nothing final until a proper examination is made." Holmes nodded once. "That is at least encouraging. What of the luncheon?" "It appears," said Lestrade, consulting his notebook, "that Lady Honoria intended to announce the engagement of Roland to her niece, Miss Marian Vane." "Ah," said Holmes softly. "There is always a luncheon when money proposes to sentiment." "There is also," Lestrade continued, "a complication. Roland had been carrying on for some time with a married woman, Mrs. Veronica Ashbourne. It was not exactly hidden, so the expected engagement was not likely to delight everyone concerned." "And Lady Honoria?" Holmes asked. "A wealthy widow, strong character. She and the niece are financially connected with Roland's business. They backed him when he was rising." "Then money does not merely propose," said Holmes. "It has already advanced the banns." Lestrade gave a dry cough. "There is another point. When Roland failed to appear, one of the guests telephoned to his rooms and claims to have spoken with him. Roland apologized and said he was delayed by his bath. That was at about 1 o'clock. Holmes's face sharpened. "And who was this useful witness?" "A man named Stephen Gower, a friend of Roland's, the sort who turns up everywhere and seems to belong nowhere in particular." "Idle?" "Comfortably so. Trusted?" "It would appear so." Holmes glanced at me. "There, Watson, is a profession more dangerous than burglary." I could see that his interest had fixed itself at once upon this alleged telephone conversation. "You suspect the call?" I asked. "I distrust any fact which arrives too neatly wrapped," said Holmes. "Continue, Lestrade." "One of the people at Roland's establishment also hinted at business trouble, copied designs or stolen ones. Something may have been passed to an American house. The dead man was said to be furious last night and trying to reach someone." Holmes took up his coat. "That is enough for a beginning. We shall go first to Roland's chambers, and afterward to Lady Honoria Vane." "As simple as that?" said Lestrade. "My dear Lestrade, nothing is simple, but one may at least begin in the right place." Within a very few minutes we were upon our way in a hansom through streets still wet from an earlier shower. London wore that washed and deceitful freshness which lasts no longer than the first passage of heavy wheels. Lestrade, wedged opposite us, gave such further details as he possessed. Lucien Roland, it seemed, occupied an elegant bachelor suite near Vigo Street. Bedroom, dressing-room, bath, and a small sitting-room where select clients or intimates might be received. He had risen late after the exertions of the previous day. Messages had reached him during the morning. He was expected at noon. At some point after 11 he had either ceased to answer his bell or had chosen not to do so. At 1, according to Gower, he answered the telephone himself. By mid-afternoon he was a corpse. "And Mrs. Ashbourne?" I asked. "She was at the luncheon," said Lestrade. "So was Lady Honoria, naturally, Miss Marian Vane, and a Mr. Bernard Lenham, who is the girl's godfather. Mrs. Ashbourne's husband may join us later, though he was not present when I began my inquiries." "And the niece?" Holmes asked, with his eyes half closed. "Young, quiet, very much upset. Whether in grief, fear, or disappointment I could not yet say." "And Lady Honoria?" Lestrade smiled thinly. "She has the look of a woman who has managed people all her life and has never yet met one who thanked her for it." Holmes said nothing more until we had reached Roland's rooms. A constable admitted us, and we passed into an interior which bore everywhere the signs of cultivated luxury. There were flowers in low silver bowls, coloured sketches pinned against screens, lengths of silk and satin thrown over chairs, and on a writing table a litter of correspondence, invitations, and illustrated journals. The whole had the air of a place in which beauty was not merely loved, but manufactured. The body had been lifted from the bath when we arrived, but the position in which it had lain had been carefully noted. Holmes passed first to the bathroom, then to the dressing-room, and then back again with the absorbed air of a man listening for some reply which only the inanimate can give. The bath itself stood against the far wall beneath a frosted window. A dark mat lay rucked slightly to one side. The black telephone receiver, disconnected now, rested upon a chair, its cord trailing back into the dressing room where the upright instrument stood upon a small table. Holmes bent over the receiver. "This is what was found in his right hand." "Yes," said Lestrade. Holmes touched it delicately and then looked toward the instrument. No dial, of course. Separate mouthpiece. Quite proper. He turned to me. "You observe, Watson, that the thing is at least period correct, which is more than can be said of many witnesses." I smiled in spite of the room. He then knelt beside the bath and examined the rim, the tiles, and the mat with minute attention. Presently he beckoned me. "There," said he. I saw at once what he meant. There were faint abrasions upon the surface where a hand might have gripped, and a slight disorder at the edge of the bath which did not agree with the notion of a man sinking quietly under some electrical shock. "There has been a struggle," said I. "A brief one," Holmes answered, "but enough." Lestrade shifted his weight. "Then you don't believe in the accident?" "My belief is of no importance. The facts are already beginning to disbelieve it for themselves." He crossed into the dressing room and stood for some moments before the telephone stand. The fixed mouthpiece rose from the instrument. The receiver cord was long enough that a man in the bath might certainly have drawn it some distance. Holmes measured that distance with his eye, then looked back toward the open bathroom door. "It could be done," said I. "Oh, certainly. 100 foolish things can be done. The question is, which foolish thing was actually done?" Upon the writing table nearby lay several trade circulars and an American illustrated paper. Holmes picked up the latter and turned a few pages. I saw a plate of fashionably dressed figures, the sort of thing which would have meant nothing to me at any other hour. But I noticed at once that Holmes's attention became singularly fixed. "What is it?" asked Lestrade. "Possibly commerce," said Holmes. "Possibly motive." He folded the journal and slipped it beneath his arm. "One of Roland's secretaries," said Lestrade, "told me he had been in a rage last evening over some betrayal. She thought it had to do with copied models shown in New York." "Did he name the man?" "She could not say." "Yet she believed it was a man?" "She seemed to." Holmes nodded and gave the room one final survey. The dead man was vain, successful, compromised in love, entangled in money, and perhaps recently betrayed in business. It is an excellent beginning. Almost too excellent. "You think the motive may lie in the design theft rather than the women?" I asked. Holmes drew on his gloves. "My dear Watson, women are so often credited with murder in society cases that one begins to suspect the men are grateful for the arrangement." As we moved toward the door, Lestrade stopped him. "One thing more, Mr. Holmes. If the doctor confirms drowning rather than shock, then the chief point will still be this telephone call. If Roland truly spoke at one, then whoever killed him must have done so afterward." Holmes turned slowly. "Just so. And if he did not speak at one, then the murderer has not merely lied. He has attempted to move the hour of death." Lestrade stared. "You think that already possible?" "I think it likely enough to be worth my attention. A murderer who invents a later conversation does so for one reason only, because the dead man was already beyond speech." He descended the stairs without another word, and we followed him out into the street. "Where now?" I asked as the cab was hailed. "To Lady Honoria Vane," said Holmes. "We have seen the stage. It is time to meet the audience." He tapped lightly upon the folded American journal beneath his arm. "For I suspect, Watson, that this affair turns upon two things only. One is the telephone, by which someone has tried to alter time. The other is this journal, by which someone may have made a profit worth killing for. As we drove toward Mayfair, I looked back once at the windows of Lucien Roland's rooms, bright now in the thin afternoon light and giving no sign of the violence which had lately been done within them. Holmes had already relapsed into silence. I knew the mood well. It meant that he was arranging his facts into those severe internal lines from which sooner or later truth emerged. Yet even then I had some inkling that this was no common domestic quarrel, but a case in which fashion, greed, and deceit had joined hands, and in which the most trivial object in the room, a black telephone receiver, might prove the most deadly. Chapter 2. The Luncheon in Mayfair. Lady Honoria Vane's house stood in one of those quiet Mayfair streets where wealth advertises itself by restraint. There was no vulgar display about the place, no gilding, no flourish, no architectural excess. Yet the moment one crossed the threshold, one became aware of money, not as a fact, but as an atmosphere. The carpets deadened one's tread. The servant who admitted us wore composure like a livery, and even the flowers upon the hall table had that costly freshness which suggests they have arrived not from a garden, but from an arrangement. We were shown first into a morning room which opened by folding doors into the dining room beyond. There the luncheon table remained laid exactly as it had stood when expectation gave way to alarm. The silver covers had been removed, but the glasses, the flowers, and the untouched places remained. It is a singular thing to see a table prepared for an announcement of happiness become, in a few hours, a sort of social mortuary. Lady Honoria received us with the self-command of one who had never yet found composure unequal to the occasion. She was a tall woman of commanding figure, dressed in dark silk, with a clear eye and an iron mouth. I could well believe that younger and weaker natures had been arranged by her all their lives, and not always with their consent. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said she. "I am glad that Lestrade had the sense to send for you. He asks questions in batches like a tax collector. I prefer a man who selects them." Holmes bowed. "I shall endeavour to deserve the distinction." She motioned us to sit. "I will save time," said she. "Yes, Mr. Roland was expected here. Yes, it was my intention to announce his engagement to my niece. Yes, I was aware that his private life was not immaculate. No, I did not consider that a decisive objection. Talented men are rarely moral, and moral men are rarely worth financing." It was as well that Holmes, who relished a hard statement even when he rejected it, had taken charge of the interview, for I own the lady's tone struck me as unnecessarily brutal. "You and your niece were financially interested in Mr. Roland's establishment?" he asked. "I provided a substantial portion of the original capital. Marion, through her settlement, provided the rest. The business has prospered." "And upon her marriage?" "Certain matters would naturally have passed from my management into another form. I suppose that is why your inspector looked at me as though I had drowned the man myself." Holmes smiled faintly. "Lestrade has a sincere but unimaginative respect for inheritance." "At what hour," he continued, "did Mr. Roland's absence begin to trouble you?" "Not before 12:30. Fashionable men are often late when they believe themselves important. Mr. Gower then offered to telephone his rooms." "From where?" She indicated the smaller room beyond. "From the boudoir there." He returned and said Lucien had answered that he was in his bath, and begged us not to delay on his account. "And you accepted this?" "I accepted it with irritation, not with alarm." "You then attempted to telephone yourself?" "I did. A few minutes later, from the instrument in my bedchamber upstairs." There was no reply. Holmes's eyes rested on her. "There are 2 instruments in the house?" "More than 2. But the one in the boudoir and the one in my room are on the private line most often used." He let that pass for the moment. "And your niece?" She had been nervous all morning. Whether from love, vanity, or instinct, I cannot say. You may judge for yourself. Marian is honest, which is the same as saying that she is at a disadvantage. Miss Marian Vane entered after a brief interval and justified at once the impression which Lestrade had given of her. She was young, barely more than a girl, but there was in her face something more than softness. Grief had sharpened rather than dissolved it. She looked from Holmes to me, and then to the room beyond, where the luncheon table stood in mute rebuke to all illusions. "You need not be careful of me," said she. "I know what has happened." Holmes inclined his head. "We are still trying to determine that, Miss Vane." She clasped her hands before her. "I can tell you one thing. Lucien did not die by accident." "Why are you so certain?" "Because he was frightened yesterday." This caught Holmes's attention at once. Frightened of what? Of something he had discovered. He would not tell me plainly. He said only that he had trusted the wrong person, and that if the matter came out it would ruin more than one life. Was this after the presentation? Yes. He was triumphant at first, almost giddy with success. Later he changed. I thought it was because of... She stopped. Because of Mrs. Ashbourne. A faint colour touched her face. Yes, or partly because of her, but this was something else. And yet you still expected him to come here and become engaged to you? She gave him a sad little smile. I expected him to do what my aunt wished, and what his interests advised. Whether his heart was in it, I never pretended to know. There was more dignity in the answer than in many happier confessions. "Did you leave the house this morning?" Holmes asked. "I walked in the park with the dog and returned before noon." "Did you see Mr. Gower make his telephone call?" "No. I only heard him say that Lucien had answered and was delayed in his bath." "And that reassured you?" "No," said she simply. "It made me uneasy." "Why?" "I cannot tell. Only that it sounded wrong. Lucien hated to be caught at a disadvantage, even with his friends." When she had gone, Holmes remained for a few moments in thought before asking for Mr. Bernard Lenham. Lenham was a man of cultivated aspect, with silvered hair, an elegant waistcoat, and the mildly weary expression of one who had spent years perfecting his opinions and had no wish to be hurried through them. His manner was agreeable, but I saw at once that Holmes placed him where he belonged, among those men whose chief loyalty is to their own style. "You were fond of Mr. Roland?" Holmes asked. "I was interested in him," said Lenham. "Fondness is for dogs and children. Grown men earn, at best, one's curiosity." "You approved the proposed marriage?" "I approved nothing. I foresaw it. There is a difference. A rich girl, a successful man, and a governing aunt. One need not be a prophet." "You made some remark to Miss Vane that alarmed her." "Did I? Then I was indiscreet. She was distressed by Mrs. Ashbourne's presence, and I told her lightly that if tragedy came it would be more likely to visit the gentleman than the lady. It seems I had the bad taste to be right. He was too polished by half, and for that reason suspicious to Lestrade, but Holmes, I think, had already measured him, and found that his danger lay chiefly in language. Stephen Gower proved of another sort altogether. He was a younger man, neat to the point of elegance, with a fresh colour, a pleasant smile, and those easy social manners which often pass with the world for character. He came in lightly, but I noticed that his eyes moved quickly before settling. "This is a shocking business," said he. "Poor Marian. Lady Honoria bears up, but the strain is severe." "You were a close friend of Mr. Roland," said Holmes. "As close as one can be with a man so much in demand. I saw him constantly." "You attended his presentation yesterday?" "Certainly. A splendid affair. He had never done better." "And today you telephoned to him?" Yes. Lady Honoria had become impatient. I went into the boudoir and called his rooms. He answered himself at once. At once? So it seemed. What exactly did he say? Gower considered with becoming care. That he had overslept, was still in his bath, and begged us not to wait luncheon. You are certain it was his voice? Quite certain. And you made this call from the boudoir? He smiled. My dear Mr. Holmes, unless I have suddenly forgotten the arrangement of the rooms, I did. Holmes returned the smile, though there was no softness in it. Quite so, one likes certainty. I do not think Gower enjoyed the remark, though he concealed the fact neatly enough. Mrs. Veronica Ashbourne entered last, and her appearance explained at once both Marian's anxiety and Lady Honoria's dislike. She was a beautiful woman, dark-haired, pale-skinned, faultlessly dressed, and very perfectly controlled. Yet hers was not the calm of innocence. It was the calm of one who had long ago learnt that weakness, once displayed, will be made a permanent tax upon the spirit. You need not spare me, said she to Holmes. I was Lucien Rowland's mistress. There is no use pretending otherwise. You save time, madam. You saw him yesterday. At the presentation, yes. Afterwards, no. And this morning? I went to his rooms at 11. He had asked me to come. He said there were things he must tell me before he came here. Did he admit you? No. I rang, waited, rang again, and left. Did that seem strange? Very. Lucien was many things, Mr. Holmes. Careless, vain, selfish, brilliant. He was not in the habit of summoning a woman urgently and then forgetting to answer her bell. You knew he intended to become engaged? She met his gaze directly. I knew that Lady Honoria intended it. Lucien intended many things according to the company he was in. You were not jealous? She gave a slight shrug. At 20, perhaps. At 38, one is generally too proud for jealousy and too tired for melodrama. Yet you were said to be pale and agitated on your arrival. For an excellent reason. Because Mr. Gower told us he had spoken to Lucien in his bath, and I did not believe him. The room grew very still. You did not believe him? No. Lucien never answered the telephone while bathing. Never. He loathed the idea of being overheard, surprised, or made ridiculous. If one rang him at such a time, he would return the call later. Holmes leaned slightly forward. You are certain of this? Entirely. It was the first statement that day which produced in him that little inward stillness, which I had come to recognize as the sign of a fact lodging exactly where it belonged. He rose at once and passed through the folding doors into the boudoir. Lestrade and I followed. It was a small and elegantly furnished retreat, with a writing table, a sofa, a lacquer screen, and, upon a side stand near the wall, the telephone instrument. Holmes examined it, then the line switch above it, then asked the butler, who had been waiting outside, whether there was another private instrument in Lady Honoria's room above. There is, sir, said the man. And must any adjustment be made for this one here to operate? The butler hesitated. Yes, sir. If her ladyship has her own instrument engaged, the little switch upstairs must be turned before this one is in use. Holmes thanked him and dismissed him with a glance that told me much had been gained. Lady Honoria, who had re-entered behind us, looked from Holmes to the instrument. Well? Holmes rested his fingers lightly upon the polished wood of the stand. Well, Lady Honoria, Mr. Rowland was loved by one woman, desired by another, financed by a third, and depended upon by several more. That gives us enough emotion for a melodrama. But melodrama rarely understands mechanics. I do not follow you. No, said Holmes, but someone here soon shall. He turned to Lestrade. We have not finished, but we have advanced. One witness has told us something impossible. Another has told us something invaluable. And if I am not mistaken, the truth now lies somewhere between a telephone call that was never made and a betrayal that has not yet been named." With that, he took up his hat and motioned me to follow him. I knew better than to interrupt him when his mind had begun to draw together its scattered lines. Yet as we descended to the street, I could not but feel that the aspect of the affair had altered. The women were no longer at the center of it. Somewhere behind the politeness of that luncheon, behind the untouched glasses and folded napkins, a man had lied about time, and in doing so had very likely lied about murder. Chapter 3. Bond Street and the American Journal. From Lady Honoria Vane's house, Holmes drove directly to Bond Street, where Lucien Rowland's establishment stood behind one of those discreet and elegant fronts which tell nothing to the casual passer-by and everything to the initiated. There was little display in the windows. The place did not solicit the crowd. It announced itself only to those ladies who had both the means and the confidence to suppose that whatever was newest in London might naturally be waiting for them inside. The door was opened to us by a grave and anxious manservant, and we were shown upstairs to the private office. If Rowland's rooms near Vigo Street had displayed the personal luxury of the man, this place exhibited his business mind. There were pattern books, bolts of silk, sketches tacked in groups upon boards, bills, account ledgers, and a long central table upon which 3 mannequins still wore gowns from the previous afternoon's display. The air carried that faint mixed scent of flowers, fresh cloth, and heated irons, which clings to any house where beauty is produced by labor. A young woman rose from the writing desk as we entered. She was pale from strain, but composed. Holmes learned that she was Miss Ellen Besant, Rowland's confidential secretary. "You have had an unhappy day, Miss Besant," said Holmes. "Yes, sir." She glanced toward the closed door. "And I fear an unhappier one still if the business of the house is drawn into it." "That," said Holmes, "depends very much upon whether the business of the house has already drawn itself into a murder." She gave a little start, but answered steadily enough. "I will tell you anything I can." Holmes wasted no time. "You were with Mr. Rowland after yesterday's presentation?" "For part of the evening, yes." "In what condition did he appear?" "At first triumphant, later extremely agitated." "On account of what?" Without a word, she opened a portfolio upon her desk, drew out an illustrated journal, and laid it before him. "It came yesterday morning by post from New York," said she, "from one of our agents there." Holmes turned the pages. Several had been marked in pencil. Presently he laid his finger upon a large plate showing a crowded showroom in America. In the foreground a mannequin wore a pale gown of remarkable grace, with a soft arrangement at the bodice which spread upward and outward like the first breaking of a flower. "This design," said Miss Besant, "was to have been the sensation of Mr. Rowland's new collection. He called it Rose at Dawn. Here it appears 3 days earlier in New York under the name of Patrick Gelman." "That is conclusive enough," said I. "Conclusive of theft," Holmes corrected. "Not yet of the thief." He looked up. "Mr. Rowland recognized it at once?" "Immediately, sir. He was beside himself. He said that if Gelman had shown that gown, then someone very close to him had sold it." "Who had seen the design before yesterday's display?" "Madame Delatour, who manages the workrooms, myself, the head cutter, 2 senior fitters, and certain intimate friends whom Mr. Rowland admitted more freely than was wise." "Name them." Miss Besant hesitated, and Holmes's eyes rested upon her. "You need not be loyal to the dead in the wrong direction," said he. She lowered her gaze. "Mr. Stephen Gower was often here, sir. Far too often, in my opinion. He came and went almost as he pleased." Lestrade, who had joined us for this part of the inquiry, gave a grunt of satisfaction. "Just as I thought." Holmes paid no attention to him. Had Gower any formal position in the business? None whatever. Then his access rested upon friendship. Yes, sir. Or upon weakness in Mr. Rowland. She gave the faintest shrug. Mr. Rowland liked agreeable people about him. An expensive taste, said Holmes. He continued to study the American plate. His attention, however, seemed gradually to shift from the gown to the audience behind it. He took out his lens, examined the second row, then turned back 2 pages and compared another photograph from the same New York showing. "Did Mr. Rowland accuse anyone by name?" he asked. "No, sir, but last evening he tried repeatedly to get someone by telephone. He said more than once, 'He has sold me. The cur has sold me.'" "A man, then?" "I assumed so." "And did he say what he meant to do?" "Yes. He said he would confront him privately first. If he could force a written admission, the matter might still be contained. If not, he would go to his solicitors." "Today?" "Yes, sir." Holmes shut the journal. "That was unfortunate for one of them." Miss Besant's face tightened. "You mean Mr. Rowland was killed because of this?" "I mean," said Holmes, "that when a man discovers he has been betrayed in love, he may make a scene. When he discovers he has been betrayed in business, he may destroy another man's livelihood. That is a different order of danger." He then asked to see the private showroom in which the collection had been exhibited. We passed into a larger chamber, bright from a glazed roof above, and lined on either side with chairs set in careful rows. At one end ran a narrow platform along which the mannequins had walked. There were mirrors, screens, and several great shaded lamps, still in position from the display. The room had the curious emptiness of a theatre after the audience has gone. All the apparatus of attention remained, but the living heat had vanished. "How many persons attended yesterday?" Holmes asked. 18, sir. Selected clients, a few journalists, and several private friends." "Was Mr. Gower present?" "Yes." "All through?" "I believe so." "Was Mrs. Ashbourne?" "She was present for most of it." "And Miss Vane?" "For part only." Holmes paced slowly down the central aisle and back again. Rowland must have known by the time this room emptied that his finest design had already crossed the Atlantic, said he. "That would poison success itself." "It did," said Miss Besant. He smiled. He accepted congratulations. He was charming to everyone. But when the last client had left, he stood exactly where you are standing now and said, "There is a thief among my friends." Holmes stopped dead. "Those were his words?" "Yes, sir." "That is useful." We returned to the office, where Holmes asked whether any photographs had been taken at the London presentation. A packet was brought to him at once. He spread them out upon the desk beside the American journal. They showed the gowns, the invited audience, and finally Rowland himself receiving compliments at the close. Lestrade leaned over his shoulder. "Well?" Holmes did not answer. He was comparing one of the New York plates with a London photograph, not in the foreground, but in the seated crowd beyond. At last he gave a little sound, not of surprise, but of satisfaction. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the lens and indicated a gentleman seated in the second row of the New York picture, half in profile, elegantly dressed, smiling toward the mannequin. Even enlarged, the image was tiny and imperfect. Yet there are some faces whose expression is so characteristic that scale does not matter. The man's pleasant ease, his neat head, his whole air of polished attendance, struck me at once. "Good heavens!" I cried. "It is Gower!" "Or his twin, equally ornamental," said Holmes. Lestrade slapped the desk. "That settles it." "No," said Holmes. "It advances it. A photograph proves presence, not murder." "But if he was in New York at Gelman's showing?" "Then he has lied by omission at the very least, and probably about a matter in which Roland had already begun to suspect him. That is excellent. It remains to show why a thief became a killer. Holmes slipped the American Journal and the marked London photograph into his case. "I shall borrow these, Miss Besant." "Certainly, sir." "One more question. When did Madame Delatour leave for Brussels?" "At 7 this morning. The journey had been arranged a week in advance." "She has not yet been informed?" "Not unless the telegram has reached her." Holmes nodded. "Then for the present she remains a useful absence and nothing more." When at last we stepped again into Bond Street, the traffic had thickened, and the afternoon light had taken on that yellowish London cast which seems to lie upon brick and stone like a film. Lestrade could scarcely contain himself. "You were right from the first," said he. "Gower sold the design to America. Roland found him out. Gower went to the chambers this morning and killed him." Holmes put up a long hand. "My dear Lestrade, you spoil many a sound case by leaping from suspicion to satisfaction. We know now that Gower had some connection with the New York affair. We do not yet know that he killed Roland. Then why the false telephone call?" Holmes turned to him sharply. "Precisely. That is the right question. If Gower is our man, the call is not a detail. It is the center of the defense. He does not merely wish to appear unconcerned. He wishes to place Roland alive at 1 o'clock. "And you think Roland was dead already?" said I. Holmes looked from one to the other of us. "Mrs. Ashbourne tells us Roland never answered the telephone while in his bath. Miss Vane says Gower's message struck her at once as wrong. Lady Honoria tells us he called from the boudoir. The servants tell us there is a particular arrangement of the line in that house." "Very good. Then before we arrest a man for murder, let us first prove that his convenient little conversation could not possibly have occurred as he described it." Lestrade frowned. "You mean to go back there now?" "At once." He hailed a cab, then paused with one foot on the step. "There are 3 elements in this case," said he. "The theft of the design gives us motive. The photograph gives us a liar. The telephone may give us a murderer. Until the third is secured, the other 2 are merely attractive." We took our seats, and as the cab turned westward again, Holmes drew out the American Journal and tapped lightly with his finger upon the tiny printed face of Stephen Gower. "Watson," said he, "never underestimate the value of vanity in detection. A modest rogue is difficult enough, but a rogue who enjoys being seen will sooner or later put himself in the frame." He folded the paper and slipped it away. "And now," he added, "let us see whether Mr. Gower has been equally incautious with a telephone." And now, before we resume, a brief word from the Bureau. Many of you ask where our stories may be found beyond YouTube. The answer is quite simple. Only one story makes its way to YouTube each week. Beyond that, we publish 3 new stories every week on Patreon, where supporters help us keep the lamps lit, the papers in order, and the next mystery upon the writing desk. For those who are not in a position to support us there, 2 of those weekly stories are also released on Spotify. And Spotify is free. There is no need for a paid membership. Much like YouTube, listening there without paying still supports the creator through advertisements. For those who prefer to support the show more directly, we also have Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal, and you will find those links in the description below. The plain truth is that our YouTube channel is not monetized. That means these stories continue only because listeners choose to support them through Patreon, Spotify, Buy Me a Coffee, and PayPal. Without that support, productions of this kind become very difficult to continue. For those who wish to step inside the archive, Patreon offers The Listening Room, $2.99 a month, ad-free episodes and early access, The Writing Table, $12 a month, voting on themes, behind-the-scenes notes, character sheets, inspirations, alternate endings, and your name in our monthly credits. The Archive Society, $30 a month. Quarterly ebook anthologies in PDF and EPUB, with your name printed among the patrons of the Archive Society. Our thanks, as ever, to those who make these stories possible. And now, back to the case. Chapter 4. The House Line. Lady Honoria Vane received our return with less surprise than impatience. I think she had already lived long enough in the world to know that when men like Holmes depart abruptly, it is seldom because they are finished. "You are back again," said she, as we were shown once more into the morning room. "Either you have discovered something, or you have forgotten something." "In my experience," said Holmes, removing his gloves, "the second condition usually belongs to policemen, and the first to their friends. I have come to test your telephone arrangements." Lady Honoria's brows rose. "My telephone arrangements?" "Yes. I find myself increasingly interested in the mechanical side of your luncheon." "That is more than I can say for the human side of it." Holmes asked that the butler be sent for, together with whichever servant best understood the line switches between the various rooms. A middle-aged housemaid presently appeared, much alarmed at being drawn into any technical matter, but under the butler's guidance she showed us what Lady Honoria had already half described. The boudoir instrument and the one in her ladyship's bedchamber were connected upon a private internal arrangement, so that unless a small switch above the bedchamber instrument were placed correctly, the boudoir receiver could not take the line. Holmes examined the little brass lever himself. "And in what position does it ordinarily stand?" he asked. "In her ladyship's room, sir," said the butler, "that being the one more regularly used." "Then unless this switch be altered upstairs, a person in the boudoir cannot ring out?" "No, sir." "Nor receive?" "No, sir." Holmes's face remained perfectly blank. "Pray oblige me with a demonstration." The servants, with the solemnity of people performing before a court, complied. I remained in the boudoir with Lestrade, while Holmes and the butler went upstairs to Lady Honoria's room. The receiver in the boudoir gave us nothing at all, not the faintest murmur of life. Presently Holmes called down to say that he had now altered the position of the switch. Instantly, with the second attempt, the instrument came alive. Lestrade rubbed his chin. "That is clear enough." "Perfectly," said Holmes. Lady Honoria, who had watched the business with thinly veiled annoyance, turned upon us. "Then what do you infer from this childish exercise?" Holmes came down again. "And that Mr. Stephen Gower could not have placed his call from the boudoir unless the switch in your bedchamber had first been altered." "Well, had it been altered?" "No." "You are certain?" "Absolutely. I used the instrument in my room later myself, precisely because it was already at hand." "You did not go to your room between Mr. Gower's supposed call and your own?" "No." "That is sufficient," said Holmes. Lestrade closed his notebook with satisfaction. "So Gower lied. He lied about the place, at the very least." Lady Honoria's eyes flashed. "What can that signify? Men often misremember trifles." Holmes shook his head. "This is not a trifle. If a man falsely places himself in one room rather than another at the exact moment when the last living words of a murder victim are supposed to have been heard, he does not do so from absent-mindedness." The lady was silent for the first time since our arrival. "Where was Mr. Gower before and after the alleged call?" Holmes asked. The butler answered, "In this room with the company, sir. He crossed to the boudoir, as we all saw, and returned in less than a minute." "Did he go upstairs at any point?" "No, sir." Holmes looked at Lestrade. "Then he did not use Lady Honoria's bedchamber instrument, and he could not use the boudoir instrument. We are left with one of two conclusions. "That he called from nowhere," said Lestrade, "or that he called no one." It was at this moment that Mr. Basil Ashbourne was announced. He entered with the air of a man who had left his work under protest and had no intention of allowing drawing-room tragedy to interfere more than necessary with his practical habits. He was a thick-set, capable person of middle age, plainly dressed and grave-faced, with nothing of romance about him. Had I met him in the city, I should have taken him for a manufacturer or engineer at once. "I understand my presence is desired," said he. "I can spare only a short time. Matters at the works do not stop because society has mislaid one of its ornaments." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "You are admirably direct, Mr. Ashbourne. You were acquainted with Mr. Rowland?" "Perfectly acquainted. My wife knew him better than I did." The remark was made without bitterness, but with an honesty almost brutal in its economy. "You were aware of the intimacy between your wife and the dead man?" "I was aware of it years ago. It no longer interests me." "That is a rare answer." "It is an economical one. Indignation consumes time, and I have found no profit in it." Holmes inclined his head. "You were at your works this morning?" "Until shortly before noon. My secretary and 2 foremen can account for me." "And afterward?" "I came here directly for luncheon." "Did you have any dealings with Mr. Rowland outside society?" "None. His trade and mine did not touch." "You never heard of any business trouble affecting him?" Ashbourne hesitated a fraction. "Only from my wife. She said last evening that he had discovered some trick played upon him over designs sent to America. I paid little attention. It sounded like the usual fashionable form of theft, well-dressed and undercharged." Holmes smiled faintly. "That will do very well, Mr. Ashbourne." When the door had closed behind him, Lestrade spread out his hands. "That clears the husband, at any rate." "It clears him very nearly," said Holmes. "A man may lie about his wife. He seldom lies that well about not caring." At Holmes's request, Gower himself was then sent for. He came in quickly and with evident curiosity, but I thought his colour a shade less fresh than before. "You wish to see me again, Mr. Holmes?" "Yes. I have been verifying a detail. You told us, I think, that you placed your call to Rowland from the boudoir." "That is my recollection." "Your recollection is impossible." Gower blinked once, then smiled. "My dear sir, impossible is a large word for a small room." Holmes gestured toward the instrument. "With the bedchamber switch untouched, this line cannot be used from the boudoir. Lady Honoria did not alter it. The servants confirm it. You did not go upstairs. Therefore you did not telephone from here." Gower's eyes shifted, very slightly, but I saw it. "Then I was mistaken as to the room," said he lightly. "One room is very like another in these houses." Lady Honoria gave a sharp sound of contempt. "You did not enter my bedchamber, Mr. Gower." "No, no, certainly not." "Then perhaps I only intended to call and believed I had done so. The confusion of the moment—" "Did you speak to Rowland at all?" Holmes asked. "Of course I did." "Where, then, was the instrument from which you called?" Gower laughed, but it was not an agreeable sound. "My dear Mr. Holmes, is a man to be hanged for not remembering the geography of a luncheon?" "No," said Holmes, "but he may be hanged for inventing a conversation with a dead man." For one instant the pleasant social surface of Stephen Gower broke outright. I do not mean that he lost command of himself, he was too practised for that, but there passed across his face an expression so quick and ugly that I should scarcely have credited it had I not seen it with my own eyes. It was not rage. It was fear. He recovered himself almost at once. "This is monstrous," said he. "If Mr. Rowland was dead already, how should I know it?" "That," said Holmes, "is precisely the question which now interests me." Gower turned to Lestrade. Do you permit this?" Lestrade, who had grown very still, answered in his driest manner. "I permit Mr. Holmes to continue whenever he saves me time." Holmes did not press farther. To my surprise, he stepped back and opened the door. "That is all for the present, Mr. Gower." Gower stared. "You detain me only to insult me." "I detain no one, but I advise you not to leave London." The man gave him one searching glance and went out without another word. Lestrade rounded upon Holmes the moment the door closed. "Why did you let him go? We have the lie." "We have a lie," Holmes corrected. "Not yet the whole use of it. He lies about the call because the time of death matters to him. Very good. But before I place him in the dock, I should like one more nail." "And what nail is that?" I asked. Holmes drew from his pocket the American journal and laid it beside one of Lady Honoria's writing implements. "The cable from New York. Miss Besant has been instructed to obtain it. If it confirms what this photograph strongly suggests, then Gower was not merely Roland's useless friend. He was the channel through which the designs passed to Gelman. Theft gives us motive. The false call gives us consciousness of guilt. One more fact, and the structure closes." Lady Honoria, who had listened in stern silence, now spoke in a lower voice than before. "You believe he killed Lucien because Lucien had discovered him?" Holmes turned to her. "I believe Mr. Roland had ceased to be merely inconvenient and had become dangerous. A parasite may live comfortably upon another man's vanity for years. The arrangement ends badly when the host discovers the bite." Miss Marion Vane had entered unnoticed during the latter part of this exchange, and now stood pale in the doorway. "Then Lucien was not killed because of me," said she. Holmes looked at her with unusual gentleness. "No, Miss Vane. You were to be used, perhaps. Mrs. Ashbourne was to be blamed, perhaps. Lady Honoria was to be suspected, certainly, but the reason was not romance. It was profit and fear." The girl drew a long breath, as though some painful uncertainty had at last given way to a colder but more bearable truth. As we drove back toward Baker Street, Lestrade was still dissatisfied. "You have all but accused him," said he. "What remains?" Holmes sat with his eyes closed. "Only the difference," said he, "between what I know and what I can prove. Never neglect it, Lestrade. Many men have been morally convicted in a drawing-room who could not be legally convicted in a court." "And you think the cable will bridge that?" "In part. The rest may depend upon Mr. Gower's nerves. They are not, I fancy, of the strongest." He opened his eyes and looked out through the cab window at the thickening dusk. "We are close now, Watson. Very close. The women fall away, the husband falls away, the luncheon itself falls away. What remains is a thief who thought himself clever, a dead man who threatened exposure, and a telephone call designed to move a corpse forward in time. That is a construction too exact to be accidental." He tapped the folded journal upon his knee. "And when the cable arrives," said he, "we shall see whether the indiscreet photograph is ready to speak." Chapter 5. The Last Call. The final stages of a Holmes investigation often appeared, to the casual observer, less dramatic than the beginning. There were no sudden chases across rooftops, no pistols fired through fog, no desperate pursuit through the midnight streets. Instead, there came a period of cold tightening, when each loose thread was drawn in, each doubtful point tested, and the whole fabric of a case prepared for that one pull which would bring it down at once. It was in that condition that the affair of Lucien Roland entered, upon the evening of our return from Mayfair. Holmes had scarcely removed his coat in Baker Street before he rang for Billy and ordered that no visitor be admitted unless upon urgent business from Scotland Yard or Bond Street. He then laid out upon the table the American journal, the London presentation photograph, and a rough diagram of Lady Honoria Vane's house, which he had drawn from memory. "For the moment," said he, We have three things. First, Roland was betrayed in business. Second, Gower lied about the telephone call. Third, Roland was certainly dangerous to someone by the morning of his death. We now require only to attach those three facts to one man, at 1 hour, in one room. And if the cable confirms the New York photograph? I asked. It will confirm a theft, said Holmes. I am now more concerned with the murder. He had barely spoken when there came a brisk knock upon the door, and Lestrade entered, carrying both a telegram and the expression of a man whose official caution had been fighting unsuccessfully with his impatience. "The doctor has reported," said he without preamble, "and this has come from Bond Street." Holmes took the medical note first. "Well?" "Drowning by forcible immersion. No sign whatever of death by electrical shock. Slight bruising at the shoulders and about the back of the neck. The doctor fixes the probable time between 11 and noon." Holmes nodded, as though hearing only what he had expected. "That is excellent." "Excellent?" cried Lestrade. "A man is drowned in his bath, and you call it excellent." "My dear Lestrade, facts are always excellent, however unpleasant. They save one from theories." He opened the telegram. It had been sent from Roland's New York agent in answer to the inquiries Holmes had set in motion from Bond Street. The private showing of Patrick Gelman's collection, it stated, had indeed taken place 3 days before Roland's London presentation. Among the English visitors particularly remembered by one of the assistants was a fair, well-dressed gentleman introduced as Mr. Gower of London. Lestrade struck the table. "There!" Holmes read the telegram again and laid it beside the photograph. "Yes, there." "You don't sound much excited." "Excitement is an admission of uncertainty. This merely confirms what the camera had already hinted. Gower was in New York and attended Gelman's showing. He never mentioned the journey. Roland discovers his design stolen. Roland tries to reach the traitor. Roland is killed before noon. At luncheon, the same man invents a telephone conversation in order to place him alive at one. The chain is nearly complete." "Nearly?" said I. Holmes rose and took down his hat. "There remains the very vulgar but very necessary question of opportunity. Let us settle it." Within half an hour we were once more at Roland's chambers. The constable on duty admitted us, and Holmes asked immediately for the porter and the maid who had first raised the alarm. The porter, a grey-haired man with an air of injured conscience, had already given evidence twice that day, and plainly resented the implication that he might have failed in any observation expected from one in his station. "You know Mr. Stephen Gower?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir, by sight, certainly, a gentleman often in and out." "Was he there this morning?" The man hesitated. "I cannot swear to the exact hour, sir." "You need not swear to what you do not know. Tell me what you do know." The porter reflected. "I was below in the front passage a little after 11, perhaps nearer a quarter past. Mr. Gower came in briskly and went up. I thought nothing of it, sir, as he was known in the house." "Did he leave again?" "Yes, sir." "When?" "I could not say to the minute. Not long after. Perhaps 10 minutes. Perhaps a little more. He went out by the front as he came in." Lestrade gave a little grunt of triumph. "Why did you not mention this before?" The porter coloured. "I was not asked about particular callers by name, sir. There are often gentlemen and ladies." "Yes, yes," said Holmes. "You were inattentive only in the usual professional way. That will do." The maid's evidence, though less precise, supported it. She had heard a man's voice in Mr. Roland's rooms late in the morning, after Mrs. Ashbourne had rung without success. She had not caught the words, but she remembered thinking it strange that the conversation sounded heated, and then ceased very suddenly. When we were once more in the empty sitting-room, Holmes stood for a long moment looking from the bathroom door to the telephone stand. "That is enough," said he. Lestrade stared. Enough? It is more than enough. We have him in the house before noon. We have the medical report. We have the New York cable. We have the false telephone story. Why not arrest him this instant? Holmes turned with that faint impatience which official zeal so often stirred in him. Because I should prefer him to condemn himself in better company. You are over-fond of these theatrical endings. Not at all. I am fond of silence after the blow falls. If we arrest him now, he becomes merely defensive. If we confront him before those whose esteem he has traded upon, he may become careless. Lestrade muttered something about civilians and their taste for scenes, but he did not press the point further. As we drove back, Holmes at last laid the case before me with a clearness which showed how nearly it had reached completion in his mind. Consider it in order, Watson. Gower is admitted freely to Rowland's house and business. He sees the designs in advance. He travels to New York and sells at least one of them to Gelman's house, perhaps more. Rowland discovers the theft from the American Journal, and by the process of elimination, or by some earlier suspicion, fixes upon Gower. He attempts to reach him that night and fails. Gower either learns or guesses that discovery has come. On the following morning he goes to Rowland's rooms. Rowland confronts him. There is a struggle, brief, but enough. Gower drowns him and leaves the body arranged for accident, the receiver in the hand, the bath to explain all. Later at luncheon, he finds an opportunity to improve his position by inventing the call. That false call serves two purposes. It explains Rowland's absence and shifts the time of death forward beyond noon. And thereby beyond his own visit, said I. Precisely. But why claim the man was in his bath? Why not say he was dressing or detained? Because he knew the body would likely be found in the bath, and wished his lie to harmonize with that fact. The ingenuity is real, but it is the ingenuity of panic. He had enough sense to move the clock, not enough to understand the telephone system in Lady Honoria's house, or to remember that New York contains photographers. When at last we reached Baker Street once more, Holmes wrote 2 brief notes. One went by hand to Lady Honoria Vane, requesting that the principal persons concerned in the matter do her the favour of assembling there again at 11 on the following morning. The other went through Lestrade to Stephen Gower, couched in terms of equal politeness and greater necessity. "You are sure he will come?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "He must. Men like Gower never believe themselves beaten until the last possible instant. Their vanity is stronger than their caution." He then sat down in the armchair and closed his eyes. I had learnt by long experience that this attitude, which to strangers might have appeared indolent, meant in reality that every point had been tested and arranged. For my own part, I was still turning over the case in my mind, and one difficulty remained with me. "There is one thing I do not yet fully see," said I. "Suppose Gower sold the designs and killed Rowland. Why risk attending the luncheon at all? Why not absent himself and avoid the danger?" Holmes opened his eyes. Because absence would itself have been suspicious. He was expected there. To fail to appear after visiting Rowland that morning would have been a blunder. No. He does what clever fools always do. He stays close to the event in the hope of directing it. He becomes the witness. He supplies the time. He appears helpful. In short, he behaves exactly as his nature compels him. Late that evening, just as I had begun to suppose the day's exertions at an end, there came yet another message from Bond Street. Miss Besant had found among Rowland's private papers a half-finished letter, begun in haste and never sent. It was addressed not to a solicitor, but to Stephen Gower himself. Holmes read it, standing by the lamp. It contained only a few lines, but those lines were enough. "You have mistaken my patience for blindness. I have at last the proof of your treachery with Gelman. If you do not come to me tomorrow morning and make a full written confession, I shall place the matter in the hands of my solicitors before evening." There was no signature, no date beyond the day, and the final sentence had broken off, but it required no comment. Holmes handed it to me. "There is your final vulgar necessity, Watson. A direct summons from the victim to the murderer." "And now?" "Now," said Holmes, turning down the lamp, "we allow Mr. Stephen Gower one last night in which to persuade himself that he is still safe." The next morning broke grey and quiet over Baker Street. Holmes was dressed and ready before breakfast was cleared, and there was that controlled brightness in his eyes which I had seen upon other occasions when the quarry was at last hemmed in. "We have all we need?" I asked as he took up his cane. "All that matters. Theft, presence, motive, falsehood, opportunity, panic. There remains only confession, whether spoken or expressed." "And if he does not break?" Holmes smiled as he opened the door. "My dear Watson, men who have built their lives upon appearing charming seldom endure for long the moment when the room sees them clearly." With that we set out once more for Mayfair, where the company which had gathered for an engagement was now to be assembled for an unmasking. Some of you have asked if there's another way to support us right now. There is one we'd like to share, and it's something my wife and I created together. Alongside Nocturnal Tales, we wrote a children's book called Sherlock Paws and the Diamond of the Nile, available on Amazon. It's a classic detective story, reimagined for younger readers, with one important twist. Sherlock Holmes is a dog. In this story, Sherlock Paws and his loyal companion Dr. Spot set off on an adventure to Egypt, where a valuable diamond has vanished. With noses twitching and tails wagging, they rely on observation, logic, and attention to detail to uncover the truth. It's a mystery full of friendship, travel, and discovery, adventurous, but always warm and age-appropriate. The goal of the book is simple: to introduce children to detective thinking in a way that feels playful and engaging. Instead of noise and spectacle, the story rewards curiosity. Children are encouraged to notice clues, think things through, and enjoy how small details matter, just as they do in classic mysteries. If you have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, or young readers in your family, this is a story we genuinely believe they might enjoy. And if you're looking for a way to support our work during this difficult period, purchasing the book helps us directly, while giving something tangible, thoughtful, and fun in return. As always, there's no obligation. We simply wanted to share something we made together with the same care we put into everything else. The link is in the description, and thank you truly for being here. Chapter 6. The Indiscreet Photograph. At 11 o'clock precisely, we were once more shown into Lady Honoria Vane's morning room, where the company had assembled under circumstances very different from those which had first brought them together. The luncheon table had long since been cleared away. No flowers softened the place now, and no silver shone to distract the eye. There remained only the room itself, the pale light of a London morning, and the small, uneasy circle of persons bound together by the violent death of Lucien Roland. Lady Honoria stood near the mantelpiece, upright as ever, though a certain stern fatigue had settled upon her features. Miss Marian Vane sat apart, pale but composed, with both hands folded tightly in her lap. Mrs. Veronica Ashbourne was beside the window, dressed in dark blue and very still, her face unreadable save for a hardness about the mouth which had not been there before. Bernard Lenham lounged with studied negligence in a chair near the folding doors, yet I observed that for all his graceful detachment, his eyes moved sharply from one face to another. Mr. Basil Ashbourne had come with an air of resigned practicality. As a man attends a board meeting, he expects to dislike, but means to survive. Stephen Gower alone attempted anything approaching ease. He was pale, certainly, but neatly dressed and self-possessed, with a faint smile which seemed intended to imply that all this fuss must soon resolve itself into some minor social absurdity. Lestrade stood near the door, and I saw that he had placed 2 plainclothes men within call. Holmes alone appeared entirely at rest. He had taken up his position beside a small writing table, and upon that table he had laid, with almost insulting simplicity, 3 objects: the American Journal, a London presentation photograph, and the half-finished letter found among Rowland's papers. Lady Honoria broke the silence. "Mr. Holmes, I consented to this gathering because you told me you could end an intolerable suspense. I trust you do not mean merely to prolong it in company." Holmes bowed slightly. "On the contrary, Lady Honoria, I mean to shorten it as much as truth permits. Mr. Rowland was not killed by an accident in his bath. He was drowned by another person, and that person is in this room." Miss Marion gave a little involuntary movement, but made no sound. Gower's smile remained, though it had stiffened. Holmes continued in the same calm voice. "The first question in such a case is naturally that of motive. Since Mr. Rowland's private life was complicated, it was easy to suppose that the explanation lay in jealousy, wounded affection, or some domestic quarrel. Miss Vane loved him. Mrs. Ashbourne had been intimate with him. Lady Honoria was financially connected with him. Mr. Ashbourne had at least the traditional grievance of a husband. Mr. Lenham possessed that philosophical detachment which often makes the police hope for wickedness where there is only vanity. All these things were plausible. None was sufficient. Lenham gave a little bow from his chair. "I am relieved to find my crimes are merely aesthetic." Holmes paid no attention. The true motive lay not in romance, but in commerce. Mr. Rowland discovered on the evening before his death that one of the finest designs of his new collection had already been shown in New York under the name of Patrick Gelman. This could only have happened if someone admitted to his confidence had sold the design abroad before its London unveiling. He picked up the American Journal and held it open. Miss Besant, his secretary, confirmed that only a narrow circle had access to the finished models. Among that circle, without any formal position in the business, moved a trusted friend, Mr. Stephen Gower. All eyes turned. Gower lifted his shoulders. "A friend may attend a show without becoming a thief?" "Quite so," said Holmes. "And a thief may travel without becoming a murderer. That is why one continues." He laid down the journal and took up the half-finished letter. Mr. Rowland did not merely suspect. He knew enough to summon the guilty man. This letter, written by his own hand and found among his private papers, was begun on the morning of his death. Holmes read aloud, "You have mistaken my patience for blindness. I have at last the proof of your treachery with Gelman. If you do not come to me tomorrow morning and make a full written confession, I shall place the matter in the hands of my solicitors before evening." A silence followed. Holmes replaced the paper carefully. "That establishes 2 things. First, Rowland had identified the man who betrayed him. Second, he expected that man to come to him on the morning of the murder." Gower laughed lightly. "A charming fragment. And because it says you, I am to supply the name. You reason dangerously, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned his head. "No. I reason exactly as far as the facts permit. Let us add another. The porter at Rowland's chambers saw you arrive shortly after 11 on the morning of the death. The maid heard a man's voice raised in anger within the rooms. The medical evidence places Rowland's death by forcible immersion between 11 and noon. You were therefore with him at the critical hour." The colour drained a little further from Gower's face, but he still retained enough control to spread his hands. "Suppose I was. Men visit one another without murder following as a matter of course." "Again, quite so," said Holmes, "which is why your conduct afterward becomes so important." He stepped toward the boudoir doors and rested one hand upon the frame. At luncheon, when Mr. Rowland failed to appear, you very obligingly offered to telephone his rooms. You then returned to this company and stated that he had answered in person, that he was delayed in his bath, and that he begged us not to wait. Yes, it was an admirable invention. Gower's expression changed at last. Invention? Yes, because you never made that call. Lady Honoria drew herself up. Marian stared. Lestrade folded his arms and waited. Holmes pointed toward the boudoir. You claimed you used the instrument in that room. We have tested it. Without the switch in Lady Honoria's bedchamber being altered first, the boudoir instrument cannot be used. Lady Honoria did not alter it. The servants did not alter it. You did not go upstairs. Therefore you did not call from there. Gower moistened his lips. Then I was mistaken about the room. No. You were mistaken only in supposing the detail would matter to no one. If you had truly spoken to Rowland, the precise instrument might be forgotten. But you had spoken to no one, and so you were forced to remember a false scene. That is always dangerous. Mrs. Ashbourne spoke for the first time. I told you he never answered the telephone while bathing. Holmes inclined his head. You did, madam. That was the second blow to the lie. Miss Vane also felt at once that the message rang false. But instinct is not evidence. Mechanics are. Gower's pleasant social mask was now broken beyond repair. This is absurd. At worst I was mistaken. Mistaken about a room, mistaken about a call. Mistaken about New York, said Holmes sharply. He snatched up the American Journal and the London photograph, placing them side by side upon the table. In this photograph of Gelman's private showing in New York, taken 3 days before Rowland's London presentation, there appears in the second row a gentleman strongly resembling yourself. In fact, he resembles you so precisely that the New York agent, when questioned by wire, remembered you by name, Mr. Gower of London. Lestrade took the telegram from his pocket and unfolded it. I have the cable here if you wish to hear it read in full. Gower had taken one involuntary step backward. Holmes advanced a pace. You sold Rowland's designs to Gelman. Rowland discovered the theft. He summoned you. You came to him on the morning of his death, perhaps still hoping to bluff or bargain. He threatened solicitors, exposure, public ruin. There was a struggle. You forced his head beneath the water and held it there. Then, in panic, you arranged the receiver in his hand to suggest some electrical accident. Later, finding yourself among persons already remarking his delay, you improved the scheme by inventing a telephone conversation which placed him alive at 1 o'clock, well after the real time of death, and safely after your own visit. Gower's face had taken on a dreadful grey shade. You cannot prove what happened in that room. Holmes's eyes flashed. Cannot I? Theft, summons, presence, falsehood and motive. The sequence is complete. You betrayed him for money. You killed him for fear. For a moment I thought the man would still attempt some further denial. Then, as often happens when a life of agreeable surfaces finally collapses, something inside him seemed to give way all at once. The smile vanished. The ease vanished. Even the carefully modulated voice vanished. What remained was a frightened and rather common man, cornered before the very people whose good opinion had been his means of living. He would have ruined me, he burst out. Do you hear? Ruined me utterly. It was one design, two, perhaps. Gelman paid well. Rowland never missed money, never missed women, never missed praise. He had everything. Why should he complain if another man took a little from the abundance? Miss Marian made a low sound of horror. Gower wheeled toward her, wild-eyed. You do not understand. Men like me are admitted everywhere and owned nowhere. Do you think your fine world pays for charm? It spends it and expects thanks besides. I had debts. I had to live. Gelman offered money for advance sketches. Roland was a fool if he believed his precious gowns were safer than banknotes. "And when he discovered you," said Holmes. Gower swallowed. "He sent for me. He had the journal. He had a letter, some proof, I do not know what. He talked of solicitors, public charges, the end of me. He mocked me. Even then he mocked me. He said I had fed too long at other men's tables." His voice sank. "He was in the bath. He laughed. I put my hands on his shoulders only to quiet him. God help me, that is true. But he struggled, and then it was done." "It was done," Holmes repeated coldly, "because you held him there." Gower gave a broken nod. "I thought of the receiver afterward. It seemed possible. Water, electricity, something of that sort. Then at luncheon, when they all looked at one another, I saw that if he had spoken later, if they believed him alive at 1, then I was safe. I only wished to quiet them, to gain time." Lestrade stepped forward at once. "You have said enough, Mr. Gower." The two men from outside entered. Gower looked wildly round the room once, as though some face there might yet save him by old habit or old liking. None did. Lady Honoria stood rigid and contemptuous. Marian had turned away entirely. Veronica Ashbourne regarded him with a loathing more complete than anger. Basil Ashbourne merely watched with the grave disgust of a practical man confronted by a shabby soul. Bernard Lenham alone sighed softly, as one does when a tiresome but long-expected conclusion has at last arrived. As Lestrade gave the formal charge and the officers took their prisoner, Gower's knees seemed for an instant to fail him. Yet he recovered enough to cast one look of hatred toward Holmes. "It was a photograph, then," he said thickly. "A damned photograph." Holmes folded the American journal. "Yes," said he. "You had arranged the death tolerably well. But you were unlucky in your audience. Cameras, unlike friends, do not flatter on principle." When the door had closed and the house at last seemed to breathe again, no one spoke for several seconds. Then Lady Honoria crossed to her niece and laid a hand, not very gracefully but with real feeling, upon the girl's shoulder. "I was wrong," said she quietly. "It appears I have been arranging lives with insufficient information." Marian gave a wan smile. "That is almost an apology, Aunt." "It is the most you are likely to receive in public." Mrs. Ashbourne moved toward the window. "Poor Lucian," said she. "He was vain enough to think betrayal impossible so long as he remained amusing." "Vanity," said Lenham, rising at last, "is the one luxury for which the world always sends in its bill." Holmes took up his hat. "The bill was paid yesterday," said he. We left shortly afterward, for Holmes disliked the afterclap of emotion once the matter itself was ended. As we drove back to Baker Street through the chill noon, I ventured to ask what had first convinced him that the women were innocent. "My dear Watson," said he, "they were not all innocent in the moral sense. But murder requires, besides motive, a certain species of immediate fear. Lady Honoria is too hard to panic. Mrs. Ashbourne is too proud. Miss Vane is too honest. Gower alone had everything to lose in 1 hour." "And the case?" He settled back with closed eyes. "The case," said he, "was decided by 3 things: a drowned man, a lying call, and an indiscreet photograph. The rest was merely society." So ended the affair of Lucien Rolland, which taught me once again that the most polished circles may conceal the most vulgar crimes, and that among all the instruments by which modern life multiplies vanity, profit, and deception, there is none more dangerous to a rogue than a machine that remembers what it has seen. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, do subscribe and share it with someone who appreciates a proper mystery. It helps more than most people think. and it remains one of the simplest ways to help this show continue. If you'd like more stories, you can find our full back catalogue on Patreon and Spotify, with extra new stories there as well. And if you'd like to support our work more directly, you can do so on Patreon. Tiers start at $2.99 with ad-free listening and extra stories, or for occasional support via Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. All links are in the description. Thank you for listening. And now, be fair before you are certain, and do not let confidence outrun the facts. Good night.